listening to The Switch. The Switch is a podcast about ideas and experiences that change our minds. I'm Chase Harris, joined as always by my co-host, Alex Berner. In this episode, we speak with Kate Dacey. Kate is an associate professor at Berklee College of Music. She teaches music history, including American music history and history of rock music. She's got a degree in history from Columbia. She's also studied at the College of William and Mary. In this conversation, we address a question. We'll do some work to define it in the conversation, but I do want to caveat this whole thing and say that we don't fully answer the question, but we do some work to explore it. We try to spend some time giving you, the listener, the tools to answer the question for yourself.
We're always trying to figure out better ways to interact with the world, and one of the big things we do is consume art, whether that's music or comedy or art or movies.
Painting.
Yeah, painting. We are interacting with this art in our day-to-day lives. And what we talk about here is, by interacting with that art, are we also interacting with the producer of that art? And if the producer of that art holds ideas that we find to be immoral or wrong, do we have a duty to connect the art with that person? If you like what we do here on The Switch, the best way to support us is through Patreon. For as little as $1, you can become part of the community. Ask us questions, suggest topics, and directly communicate with us. You can also unlock bonus content like extra questions we ask our guests. If you want more of The Switch, both on topic and off, you can become a patron at www.patreon.com/switch_podcast. You can also check us out on social media. On Instagram and Twitter, we are at @switch_podcast. And on Facebook, we are The Switch Podcast. The Switch is produced by Mojo Filter Media, a company specializing in audio production for video games and interactive media. You can check out our website at www.mojofilter.media.
So, without further delay, our conversation with Kate Dacey. I would like to introduce today's guest on the podcast, Professor Kate Dacey, Berklee College of Music. Kate, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, before we get started, this episode, we do have sort of an overarching question, an overarching theme that we're going to get at. And it has to do with finding an objective moral stance on something subjective, art in particular. But before we get to that question, and we'll spend a little time defining exactly what we mean and all that, I do want to get your story. So, Kate, where do you come from, and how did you get to where you are today?
Okay. I grew up in the Boston area, and I was a musician when I was a teenager. I played oboe and English horn, and I spent a lot of time schlepping into the New England Conservatory on weekends and playing in orchestras and wind ensembles there. And when I got to college, I was faced with a decision about whether I wanted to be a music performance major, which I had the opportunity to do, or to do something else. And I think I realized my personality was not suited to being a professional oboist. And I also realized the world would not be sad if I decided not to pursue that path. So I ended up being a history major. So I went to Columbia and did a history degree as an undergraduate. I worked for a while, but the idea of doing something with music, either scholarly or in terms of performance, never went away. And so I ended up eventually going back to school, first for a master's degree in American Studies, where I was looking at American music in the context of the 1930s and 1940s in particular. And as I was working on those projects, I realized that I really wanted to immerse myself more fully in music. So I spent a little bit of time beefing up my music theory background, which was a little bit piecemeal. And then I started a graduate program in musicology. I ended up at Berklee sort of by chance. I started working on a curriculum project at Berklee, and then I just hung around so long, they finally gave me a faculty job, I think is what it basically amounted to. And I found Berklee a really congenial place. I've developed new areas of specialization. When I was in grad school, I was focused primarily on Soviet composers and Russian composers, as well as what we might consider American art composers, people like Gershwin and Copland. And since getting to Berklee, I've spent most of my time actually researching the history of the music industry, thinking about copyright in music and thinking about the way in which the music industry turns basically this very basic human activity into a commodity, something that can be bought and sold. And I'm actually working on a book right now for Routledge called Inventing the Music Industry, which looks at that whole process. So it's meant to trace out the history of the industry, primarily over the 19th and 20th centuries, and think about how the industry has responded to technological change and changes in consumption patterns and that kind of thing. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Yeah. So, and what kind of curriculum do you teach at Berklee? With that's a fairly broad spectrum of expertise. But is that what you're teaching, or what are your classes like?
Right now, I teach history of Western music, which is how I know Alex. He took that class with me a number of years ago. That's a pretty standard one-semester survey of Western music history. I also teach rock history at Berklee and written an online course that I teach. I teach a class on the history of the music industry, which specifically traces out the same material that's going to be in my book. And I also teach a class on radio and television and thinking about the uses of music on radio and television, which is a little bit different than film music, for example. So I look at that. So some of that is thinking about the commercial uses of music on those two platforms, and then thinking about the dramatic use of music on those two platforms.
Mm-hmm. So I think, that's a fairly good introduction. I mean, the topic for today, I don't know if we could find anyone better than this to talk about this topic. You're probably the perfect person to have this discussion with. So I think the next step here is to really define the question that we want to dive into today. And Alex and I were talking about it earlier. And Alex, do you want to sort of give your version of what this question looks like, and we can sort of, build our way toward a collective understanding of the question before we try to find the answer?
Yeah, and I've tried to start over and over again trying to get a clear definition in my head. So if any point this makes sense, you want to change anything, let me know. But basically, with art and our relationship with art is subjective, but it's still people who are creating art, and our relationship is not just with the art, but therefore the artist as well. And I think that degree could be more or less specific. You could, if you're going up to somebody and buying their music directly from them, that's a different thing than buying a painting from 300 years ago. But since there is this relationship with the people making it, if they have a political or ideological view or position that we find to be immoral or
disagreeable in some way.
Yeah. Do we have to treat the art in a different way than we would the person themselves?
Yeah.
So if I don't, I might not want to associate with a Nazi, but should I have the same should I still not want to associate with any type of art that's associated with Nazis, basically, in an extreme example?
So, yeah, and I think it'd be good to definitely define a couple examples to keep in our minds throughout the discussion to see if we can, use those as sort of railings to guide us. The first example I thought of when we were coming up with this topic was Radiohead. I'm a huge Radiohead fan. And some of their songs are more or less about politics. Some are much more overt, some are, very subtle. And, the Radiohead frontman, Tom York, has been very vocal politically. And he and I don't align totally on politics. I think his heart's in the right place, but I think he's wrong about some things. Should my opinion of his politics change the way that I see Radiohead's music? Another example we came up with was Wagner, who I guess, and I'm not the expert in Wagner, but he had some anti-Semitic leanings, but his music is not outright anti-Semitic propaganda. Should my opinion of him as a person change my ability to appreciate his music. Alex already started to give the Nazi example. If you're somebody who appreciates architecture and you see like Nazi German architecture and you see, there's this beautiful symmetry and these straight lines, but obviously the ideology that produced it was detestable to, the highest degree that we can detest things. Should that affect your appreciation of that architecture? That's sort of those are sort of the range of examples that we came up with. Mm-hmm. Kate, do you feel like you want to weigh in on the question? Yes,
I think that's the way that you framed it is helpful, especially the examples at sort of two poles, Radiohead at one pole and Wagner at the other pole, when you're really talking about degrees of difference, because I think that is a really important question. I mean, if you asked me, I'd say one of the hardest things about this question is that my own opinion of the art invariably bleeds over into whether or not I'm willing to divorce myself from somebody whose public conduct is reprehensible. So it's much easier for me to cancel Chris Brown for being violent toward women than it is for me to cancel Wagner, because I look at Wagner's music and his impact on the history of Western music, harmonic practice, use of leitmotif, his impact on orchestral practice, orchestration practice. And it's harder for me to separate myself from that and my appreciation of his music. And so I think that that's something that also factors into any kind of moral calculus about the art. Does the value of the art at some point end up determining whether or not we ostracize somebody or remove them from the canon? And that's, I think, from a musicologist's point of view, a real question.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we sort of have to take axiomatically here is that we're trying to establish sort of an objective either line or area into which we can say, okay, these things fall on this side, these things fall on this side for, is it ethical to be an audience member or a consumer of, this art?
And we wanted to kind of separate the definition of when we use the word audience and consumer, because you could be an audience and not be buying or, actively consuming art in a more capitalistic type of way. And we wanted to differentiate that from consumer, which would imply that you are choosing to purchase or directly support the art, basically, or the artist.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's a
I
helpful
do, actually,
distinction?
because it speaks to, for example, going back to the example of Wagner. If you think about Wagner in Israel, I mean, he's a very potent symbol. You can find performances of Wagner's music on Israeli television and radio. You can purchase copies of Wagner's music, but the operas have never actually been staged in the modern state of Israel. And the few conductors who have actually led performances of Wagner's music have been very careful about how they framed it. They've given audience members permission to leave if they found the symbolism of performing Wagner's music in Israel too distasteful or disturbing. And in that sense, I think that that's, the fact that it's how it circulates and who is encountering it and whether it requires a level of intentionality is an important consideration, I think, as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what are the factors here that are sort of important to what we're talking about? Like, obviously, you can talk about the human being Wagner had these opinions, but as far as I know, his music wasn't an expression of anti-Semitism. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. So a case like that where the music itself isn't the anti-Semitic act, but the person who created it had these opinions, versus something I can't think of an example off the top of my head, or something like Radiohead, where the music itself is an expression of the whatever it is you disagree with. So what are some of the other sort of important factors to consider when we're talking about this question?
Well, I think one of the things you brought up, which I think is really important, is the degree to which the audience contributes to the understanding of who that composer is and what his music represents. So I think right now in the popular realm, we're grappling a lot with R. Kelly's legacy, in part because we think about him as this sort of sexy R&B singer, and sexuality is very much a part of how he markets himself. And as we've learned more about who he is and how he treats young women of color, that's made listening to his music a really uncomfortable experience in a way that it might not have been before those stories started circulating in the media, that you might have been able to simply listen to them and think about them as sexy jams. And that was, that's it. And so I think that when you talk about someone like Wagner, you're right to say that Wagner himself did not attach any explicitly anti-Semitic meanings to his songs, that there has been a long tradition of reading or looking for evidence of anti-Semitic intent in some of his music. And you can certainly read people's interpretations of operas like Parsifal, or some of the characters in the Ring cycle like Alberic, who is the dwarf who sets the entire story in motion, that in Wagner's own time, there certainly would have been audience members who might have understood him as a kind of caricature of a wealthy Austrian Jew. But I think by and large, those are all manufactured meanings, or things that people are bringing to the work rather than things that are intrinsic to the work. Mm-hmm. So for me, I think that's an important consideration as well. Is it intrinsic to the work? As you say, with Radiohead, lyrics make their intent much more explicit. Or is it something that sort of surrounds the work and may dissipate over time? I mean, going back to that example of Wagner, Wagner's music clearly doesn't mean the same thing to us in 2018 than it did to Austro-Germanic audiences in the 19th century. Any more than listening to Shostakovich, do we really have any sense of what his politics were? When we're listening from 2018, we might be able to project ourselves into the world of the Stalinist 30s, but we can't really recover that context or experience it in the same way. So it's impossible to know, how people received it or understood it. We can only look at the historical record and see how people have written about it and infer from that. But again, there's another example of somebody who didn't make any explicitly political statements that would allow us to infer content or meaning or intention. So I think in those cases where the audience is bringing something to, or creating a kind of paratext around the work, it's always important to tease that out and try and separate that as much as we can from the music itself.
Mm-hmm. And another important distinction, it seems to me, is the era in which it was produced, if the artist is alive or not. And also, is your consumption of the music having direct harm on anybody? Like, is there a direct line from that? Because I think in that case, it's fairly easy to make a case for, it's wrong to support this person if by supporting them, you're perpetuating their ideology or behavior. But I think it gets trickier, like with Wagner, where he's dead, so you're not helping him.
Right.
So it becomes... Yeah, kind of like we were saying about the ideology, and even if it's not explicit, is like maintaining the presence of that person and their work, also maintaining the presence of their beliefs.
Right.
Right. Like, is your relationship, as a consumer of art, is it purely aesthetic? Is it political? Is it financial? I think all those things absolutely make a difference.
Well, we all embody a number of contradictions about that. I mean, I think, when you think about receiving some music, for example, and feeling like its message is more authentic because of the style of delivery, Pussy Riot has something valid to say because they're angry and screaming and they're using obscenities, as opposed to somebody expressing similar ideas in a more polite and perhaps musically appealing fashion. And I think, too, going back to that idea of paratext, I mean, with Wagner, his own writing about music does invite anti-Semitic readings of his music. I mean, he published a pamphlet in 1850 called Judaism and Music, which partly grew out of his own professional jealousy of Meyerbeer and Mendelssohn. He published it anonymously in 1850. So when he was living in exile in Switzerland, he published this pamphlet 3 years after Mendelssohn died, and sort of suggested that Judaism and Jewish culture were contaminating German music. And that was an idea that he revisited and reworked through some of his essays. It appears even earlier than 1850 in his essay, Artwork of the Future. And in 1869, he republished that original pamphlet, Judaism and Music, with his name attached and with some revisions to it. So clearly, this was something that preoccupied him. And when we're doing scholarship about Wagner, we can't ignore that aspect of his personality or totally discount the idea that his anti-Semitism may have creeped into the work that he created. But it's pretty hard to make an argument that there is any explicitly anti-Semitic content in Wagner. And that, again, this is something that emerges through study of Wagner or from being alive in the time period of Wagner and going into it with certain sets of stereotypes that were very real for you. And so an Austro-Germanic audience member seeing a performance of The Ring and sort of understanding some of the characters as being coded or embodying certain types and inferring something from that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because in a lot of instances, I think most of these ideas would just go over people's heads. Like most people who hear Wagner on the radio probably don't know a lot about him. They probably haven't read his essays. Mm-hmm. So I guess that kind of brings up the issue of, do you have more responsibility the more you know? Like Chase, you gave that example of the painting. Would you want to?
Sure. Yeah. So this is an example we've been playing with for a little while. So the scenario is, you go to an estate sale or something, and you find this painting. It's really beautiful, and you take it home and you display it in your living room or wherever. And for maybe a couple years, you've got guests over and people are coming in and out appreciating this painting, and you don't really know where it came from. It's not signed, and it becomes an integral part of the experience of being in your home, and to whatever degree it becomes part of you in that way. And then you stumble upon the fact that this was one of Hitler's paintings, and so now you have a decision to make, because you sort of can't deny that from an aesthetic perspective, for whatever it's worth, you did appreciate that work of art, but sort of in ignorance of where it came from. But now that you know where it came from, what is your responsibility, knowing that you haven't made any monetary contribution necessarily to Hitler's legacy. You definitely haven't made any political contribution, but you can't escape the fact that it was this guy who did it.
Well, I think that's an interesting example, because if you destroy the painting, having learned that Hitler painted it, you're not erasing Hitler from the historical record. And I think that's one of the things that makes it different than some of the other examples that we've been talking about a little bit. And Alex and I, in preparation for this, we're talking a little bit about Bill Cosby, because he's a figure who comes up in my radio and television survey when we're talking about the history of the medium. And he's unquestionably a really important pioneer in the field of television. Right now, however, after the most recent trial and dozens of women coming forward and sharing their stories of what their interactions with Bill Cosby, he's virtually disappeared from the public eye. And I don't mean that he's not going out in public. I mean, if you go on a platform like Amazon, it's almost impossible to find any episodes of The Cosby Show, even though from the standpoint of the history of television, this was an incredibly important show. So when we're talking about this, sometimes there's a case to be made for expunging something, so taking Hitler's paintings and destroying them, versus something where the legacy of the person really is most obvious in their art. And that becomes a more complicated moral calculus, at least for me it does, because my inner historian would hate to see something important like The Cosby Show or I Spy permanently deleted from the historical record, because in understanding the medium of television, it's really important to understand how Bill Cosby first got onto television and then used his critical and commercial success on I Spy to really create a different kind of African-American presence on television than anybody had seen in the 1960s or early 1970s. And for that reason, I'd feel uncomfortable if, for example, I've been watching The Cosby Show in ignorance of these allegations that have swirled around him for a number of years, and then I discovered that. I would hate to think that disappeared altogether, and so that 50 years from now, historians wouldn't have something to look at. I do understand the impulse to pull him from commercial platforms, so not making him available, right, say, through Hulu or something like that. From a business standpoint, that makes sense. From an ethical standpoint, it makes sense. But I also think that it's important that somewhere along with that conversation about sort of removing the commercial benefits that he's deriving from having those things circulating in the public eye, that we're still talking about preserving them for the historical record.
Yeah, and you use the phrase moral calculus, which I think is worth highlighting, because part of what we're doing is not just sort of feeling out, well, does it feel right to keep consuming this work, or does it feel right to destroy the painting? We're also talking about what are the real implications. Like, so we sort of have an implied metric of well-being that we're talking about. If you follow the line of somebody like Sam Harris, who talks about the well-being of conscious creatures being the sort of grounding metric to use for ethics, you could say something along the lines of, whatever action I take in terms of consuming Bill Cosby's work or, this painting, you can decide what to do based on how much you can improve the well-being of conscious creatures. In the case of Bill Cosby, the example might be, well, let's say it costs you, I don't know, 10 cents to find an episode of The Cosby Show, and that's your contribution, and maybe 1 cent of that makes it back to Bill Cosby, the person. Can you offset that by, like, donating to a women's shelter or something? Like, can you make that kind of calculation with it? Or, is it more complex than that in reality?
Well, I think that's an interesting approach to it. I think my inclination would be not to stream it through any kind of platform where he's going to get a residual, because that whatever money he generates from that probably is going into his legal defense now, because so many people have spoken out against him. And there are enough lawsuits pending at the moment that I think that it would be hard to imagine that money going to anything else. And I fully believe 60 women, I think, now have come forward to bring accusations against him. And I find them credible. I mean, they've risked their reputations and, risked public scorn and humiliation to do it, and derived no benefit from doing that. There's nothing financially to be gained by coming forward with an accusation like that against somebody as powerful as Bill Cosby was. So I think that, there's a sort of that, for me, the moral calculus is it's possible to preserve that creative record while still denying him income from it now. And I think that for me, that would be an acceptable compromise, that I'm not aiding in his legal defense against these crimes. And while I'm still, as a historian, taking the responsible view of preserving that legacy for other TV and film critics to go and evaluate 100 years from now or 50 years from now.
And I think another part of the calculation would be, how much is your support or perpetuation of his show in the current moment, a hard thing for the victims. If he's still, very ubiquitous in the culture, and they, get glimpses of him all the time, is that, that's something that would be harmful to them to have to, keep seeing him everywhere. So, then adding that into all the rest of the stuff, I think that's why I wanted to talk about it. It's an interesting calculation to try to make, and we, like you were mentioning, preserving his work for the cultural records. And that seems to make a ton of sense, because we've always done that, and that's how we learn from the past. So I think starting a policy of erasing, bad things just doesn't seem to make sense when we've learned so much from atrocities. And, we're not going to go wipe out any texts from Nazi Germany, because there's something to be learned from that.
That's sort of the the sort of politically balanced argument that I've heard around things like the Confederate statues in the South, where you've got these big statues of Confederate leaders, and the argument that I've heard is, well, don't destroy them. You know, they belong in museums. They obviously don't belong in public areas because, you know, again, it's this moral calculus that it's more harm than good to leave them there. But, you know, it seems like the ethical thing to do would be to preserve it for historical records. Yeah, it makes sense to do something similar here. I brought this question of the Hitler painting up to a friend of mine, and he sort of jokingly gave an answer that, the more I think about it, is it's worth bringing up. He said, "Well, whoever sold it to you obviously knew and didn't tell you, so maybe what you should do is sell it to somebody else and don't tell them. You know, if it's a nice painting, maybe they'll get some appreciation out of it."
Yikes!
You know, if nobody knows, then all the better.
Wow. Well, it does say a lot about how much those kinds of paratexts inform our opinion of things. I mean, whatever else that thought exercise does, it certainly forces you to think about the way in which we create meaning when we're looking at a work of art or when we're listening to a piece of music. And I think that that's important because ultimately our own aesthetic responses to these things get deeply entangled with any kind of moral stance that we take. Now, to your earlier point about the Confederate statutes, I think it's sort of in the abstract, I definitely would agree with the idea of preserving some of them. But I also am worried that in that act, if we don't bring in historians to really contextualize what they're doing, that we're really just moving them from one location to another. And it may be less reprehensible because we're not actively reminding people of the institution of slavery and the architects of that institution in a problematic way. But I think, for example, if you put it on display in an art museum without acknowledging that a lot of these statutes were built during a period of time when Jim Crow was being enshrined in law in the Deep South, and didn't acknowledge the sort of symbolism of these statues, that these weren't put up immediately after the Civil War to honor fallen heroes, but these were meant to be visible signs of white supremacy. If you don't say that and you don't make people understand that and feel it, then I don't know. Maybe in that case, it's better to destroy the statue. So I don't know. There's a lot of complexity to this. And one of the things I've enjoyed most about this discussion is that you guys have a knack for picking truly provocative examples that I'm sure I will go back and forth all night about my answers.
Yeah, and I think like what you said about the historians, giving an analysis of these statues, like it is important that they were built in a different time period than some people think. It wasn't right after the Civil War, in honor of people. It was, the intention was to perpetuate Jim Crow and not as much give service or not as much to give homage to those people themselves, the generals. So I think what you mentioned with the historians is kind of like giving a caveat when you observe the statues. It's like maybe a written plaque below it that talks about the history. And I don't necessarily say we shouldn't destroy them either, but I do wonder, I guess this is a question to bring up. Do caveats help or can they help? Do they always help? Like if you pull up a Bill Cosby sketch on YouTube and show it to people, it'd feel weird if you didn't say, this guy's a horrible person and he did all this bad stuff now that that's out there. But does that absolve you of bringing it up? I guess?
Well, I've struggled with this a lot with The Simpsons because I've used The Simpsons in my radio and television class because of the really sophisticated use of musical parody on the show. And we usually spend a week talking about music and animation since, particularly in the world of television, that's a place where there's a really distinctive style of scoring that's evolved to support animation, and animation really demands music in a way that certain other kinds of programs don't. And if you look at the amount of music that's used in a program like The Simpsons or South Park, Some of those practices map onto what you'd find in a sitcom or a news program, but then there are also characteristic ways of writing for animation that are unique. And so I've talked a lot about The Simpsons. But hearing Matt Groening's response to criticisms of Apu has really made me profoundly uncomfortable, because I feel like the criticisms are completely valid. Having Hank Azaria doing that voice, doing a stereotypical white Westerner's impression of what a Pakistani or an Indian immigrant would sound like, that's innately problematic. It's brown face, really. I mean, it's just without him actually physically embodying the character. And the fact that Groening didn't think it was a big deal, and he's been dismissive of criticisms of it, was really disappointing. And I've wondered sort of how to handle it. I think right now my main strategy is to avoid using any clips that use Apu in class, and directing students to that article. Again, the caveat, the asterisks. But sort of morally, I feel like there's probably more I should be doing, and I haven't really thought what exactly that would be. If it's finding an alternative that's less controversial, partly because, or if it means spending more time directly engaging with the portrayal of that character on The Simpsons and thinking about where he fits into the history of racism and animation. So it's a tough question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not all that familiar with the controversy around The Simpsons or that particular example, but I think it's definitely interesting to sort of contemplate, the consumer's responsibilities. So Alex actually came up with a cool example for another question. Why don't we do this the other way? So if Gandhi had put out a mixtape and it wasn't good, right? But we appreciate Gandhi's political stance or his message, would we appreciate it more even though the art from an aesthetic perspective was subpar?
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. That's well, I'm laughing in part because I'm teaching somebody else's online course called Music, Self, and Society. It's something that Berklee Online offers to students in their degree programs. And they have a whole week. There's a whole week that looks at music and politics. And there's an exercise in that particular lesson that's a variation on the question that you just asked, which is, if somebody produces political work that is sincere, but it sort of fails to meet certain aesthetic criteria, should we still recognize it as art? Is it powerful? Will it sway minds and hearts? And I think that's a really difficult question, because the political art that tends to stir us the most does so in a really visceral way. And something which is sincere but mediocre probably isn't going to do that. That it's, we're much more likely to get hung up on the aesthetic packaging or presentation of it than we are to really think about the message and whether or not the music is an effective vehicle for it. So I don't know about that Gandhi mixtape. I don't know if I'm going to be, adding that to my workout playlist or not. Sounds very earnest and high-minded. But I think it does beg a question about, whether or not you can create political art intentionally that doesn't feel almost burdened by the good message behind it. Because I'm struggling to think about a few explicitly political songs that are sort of really musically effective. I mean, there's been a whole subgenre, for example, of really powerful, blistering anti-Trump hip-hop tracks, basically diss tracks. I think the most famous example, of course, was Eminem's. But if you could spend hours on YouTube just looking at music videos and listening to people's tracks. And some of them are musically effective. Some of them are not. All of them are incredibly sincere and powerful because of the language that they use. I don't know if we'll be listening to them in 10 or 15 years or not. So it's sort of hard to pass any kind of meaningful judgment on them. But it's a really sort of interesting variation on that same question that you're asking, which is that if someone's really moved by a political situation, they write something that very explicitly about that political moment, is it going to stay with us 5 or 10 years later when the sort of immediacy or urgency of that song starts to recede a little bit? Or is it going to sort of eventually stand on its own 2 feet as music? Because so much of the protest music, for example, that we think about as being timeless or speaking to the condition of the 60s, if you really look at it, it's generic enough in its lyrics that it can sort of be ripped out of that context and put into another situation. I mean, Bob Dylan's music exemplifies that beautifully. People talk about him as being an explicitly political musician, but if you really look at a song like Blowing in the Wind, there isn't a lot there that's specifically about 1962. I mean, that you could apply some of those ideas to the political climate of 1962, but it's pretty hard to say that it's really explicitly about that. So it's a really interesting question. It's complicated by lots of variables. And then, of course, on some level, it boils down to the aesthetics of it, too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems to me that my intuition sort of flips when you give the positive example, right? So for something super negative, if it's not explicitly political, I guess it depends. But it seems that, for some people, the political is weighted more highly than the aesthetic if the politics are seen in a negative light, whereas the other way around, if you agree with the politics, then it's the aesthetic that is more important. It's interesting to see that sort of dichotomy on either side of the line.
Well, I think the Sex Pistols are an excellent litmus test for that. When you think about, think about them just from a purely objective standpoint, they're really kind of a terrible band. And I say this as somebody who, I remember buying Nevermind the Bollocks on cassette and thinking that, I was really rebellious and, listening to it and being angry with it and feeling it, and now, of course, at this stage in my life, I can understand objectively why they were important to the history of rock and roll, but they're really kind of a terrible band on a very basic musical level. And I feel like they've ended up occupying this sort of outsized position or place in the history of rock because of the political message and the fact that it was so raw and unfiltered that people latch onto that without thinking about it as being a commercial product, which it most certainly was. I mean, this wasn't some obscure thing that sort of tumbled into the public consciousness. This was marketed really in a canny fashion, and Malcolm McLaren played a really instrumental role in creating the Sex Pistols image and persona. And he was very conscious of branding. So, once you start to think about that and you think about the endurance of that particular album and some of the songs on it, it really makes it it's an interesting question. Like, what is it that people are responding to? Are they really saying this is a great rock and roll band? Or do they sort of just like the anti-establishment sentiment of the song and the fact that it's being screamed at them over, sort of music that sounds like anger? And I don't know. It's a really good question.
Yeah. And you mentioned that your view of the Sex Pistols had sort of changed over time. Do you feel like, you would have taken this art and politics question a little differently at a different stage in your life? Or do you feel like, you've sort of always had a consistent, do you think you would have come to the same conclusions or had the same thoughts that you're thinking in our conversation today, back when you bought the Sex Pistols album?
Right. Unquestionably, my thinking has changed a lot. When I think about some of the music I listened to when I was 16 or 17 years old, going back to that whole example of late 70s, early 80s British music, I loved the Smiths at one point in my life. I absolutely couldn't listen to it now, knowing what a deep misogynist and racist Morrissey is. I don't have any trouble canceling him, in part because you can hear notes of that in the lyrics of a lot of Smith songs. So that even though, sort of my own aesthetic opinion of the music hasn't changed all that much, I find it really hard to listen to that music knowing what I know about him now. I feel that way about some songs by The Cure as well. When I listen to them and I listen to this sort of grotesque misogyny in some of these songs, I was like, how did I listen to this when I was 17 years old and not feel deeply offended as a woman on some level? And I think it's really only with a certain amount of critical distance that I can really tease out those feelings and articulate them in a way that I might not have been when I was 17 or 18 years old.
And I think that, shows how much of our interaction with art is what we project onto it, like we mentioned earlier. You can there's songs that are about sex that you listen to when you're 8 and sing along to, and you have this totally different interpretation of that.
Right.
And, and it just shifts over time. And I think a big part of what we're talking about is your knowledge about it. You know, the more, like I brought up before, the more knowledge you have, it seems like maybe the more responsible you are. So with that knowledge, do you have a duty to help other people to gain that knowledge, or do you kind of leave them blissfully unaware? That's kind of like Chase's, example, the painting, just pass it on.
Right.
Especially if there's an indirect, like if the relationship to the ideology or politics is indirect.
Right.
If it's a song that's, from a neo-Nazi group that's explicitly,
right,
anti-Semitic, and you can't really pass that on without saying something.
Right. Well, because if you don't, it seems like you're explicitly, or implicitly endorsing it by just passing it along uncritically without some kind of commentary. I think the two examples that we've been talking about, the Sex Pistols and Morrissey on one hand, and then The Cure on the other. I mean, I don't know anything about Robert Smith that would make me think that he's a rotten human being in real life or anything like that. So a lot of that is just a direct reaction to the art itself, to the lyrics and in songs that where sort of aesthetically, I responded to the aesthetic of the song really strongly when I was 17 or 18. But now as an adult, you just can't stomach the lyrics. That's a little bit different than what the other example, which I brought up, which is that everything I've read about Morrissey, I tried to actually read a novel that he'd written, and I was just about 15 or 20 pages in, I just bailed because the contempt for his female characters was so palpable that it just made my skin crawl. He's criticized the mayor of London and attacked the way he pronounces certain words with a really strong undercurrent of racism in the way that he's critiquing the mayor of London. He's just really been his own worst enemy in the public, sort of in using his platform really irresponsibly. So that's a little bit different because I have a harder time pointing to a Smith song in particular where I feel like those ideas are really front and center to the song. But knowing all those things about him have really complicated my relationship with that music. So that's just something that I've ended up abandoning and moving on.
Yeah. I think a lot of our relationship with art is complicated, just inherently. And like we're trying to do here is find some measure of objectivism in a subjective space. It'll always be complicated. And even if we find something that we feel to be objective for us, it may not quite be transferable based on somebody else's knowledge or circumstance of listening to it or their point in life. So I feel like I guess it's kind of hard to say it's objective if it's not transferable, but I feel like that's the best way to describe it. Like if you're in that situation at that time, it's objectively right or wrong. Chase, does that make sense to you? Like,
well, so my mind keeps coming back to the moral calculus idea and of really using a specific metric. And to me, the metric of the well-being of conscious creatures is it's very salient to my own values. But I think the question that I sort of had in the back of my mind with this is, we talk about ethical action in having different responsibilities for different situations. And it really comes down to like harm done, something like, Bill Cosby versus Wagner. Like if I go put on Wagner on Spotify, that's not really contributing to some sort of anti-Semitic political agenda, especially if, my intentions are purely aesthetic and I have no political leaning there, versus something like Bill Cosby, where even if my intentions are purely aesthetic, there is sort of an ethical implication. So I guess my question would be, how do we navigate, especially with modern examples, the sort of real, the examples that have real moral consequences versus something that's sort of generated by people who like to be outraged at things?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of this in the world of film, thanks to the Me Too movement. That somebody like Roman Polanski is an example of this, or Woody Allen. And it does pose a lot of difficult challenges. I mean, for me, Woody Allen was a tougher case than Roman Polanski because I've never particularly been a fan of Roman Polanski's movies. And so for me, it didn't feel like a loss to decide that there was too much, that I was supporting somebody who was, who had assaulted an underage girl and seems to have had a pattern of doing that. I didn't have any problem divorcing myself from his film legacy and not contributing to supporting him as an artist. I think with Woody Allen, I had more complicated relationship because there are Woody Allen movies that at various points in my life were really important to me. I think Hannah and Her Sisters was a big reason I went to college in New York City, because I'd seen that movie and it had made a really indelible impression on me about New York as a place where intellectuals lived and creative people lived. And there was something about the romance of this world he was depicting in the movie that appealed to me really profoundly when I was 18, 19 years old. And I know I've struggled with that one a lot more. I think for a lot of people, again, am I harming Woody Allen's adopted daughter by embracing his movies and supporting him? And I've made the choice not to keep watching, not to keep doing that for that very reason, because I'm really uncomfortable with that whole scenario. And I don't feel like I need to wait for a court verdict to validate that feeling.
Mm-hmm. Do you think we could make the statement that if you are a consumer of a living artist and you're consuming their art, you are supporting that artist, whether it's financially or their fame, basically? Like, is that a... Mm-hmm. Can we decide on that as a true statement?
I would say it's a true statement when you think about the complexity of the entertainment industry and the fact that you could have created something 20 or 30 years ago and it's still actively being consumed now in a way that wouldn't have been true if you'd written a symphony 150 years ago. I think it's a valid consideration in an era where electronic media sort of give an eternal life to certain kinds of music and television and movies.
Yeah, no, I just think that's an important line to make, if to not necessarily for us to move forward, but for people to move forward in their interpretation of if they're supporting somebody or not, because you can kind of be in denial. Oh, I just watched it on YouTube,
Right.
But there is, even if it's the smallest amount, you're adding a view count or a penny in monetization to that person. I suppose you could watch it on a source that is indirect, stolen content or whatever it is. But it seems like, especially in this world where there's fame, ends up equaling money too, and success, that these are also interconnected, that there's not a way that you can totally divorce yourself from that as long as a person's alive. So for me, I think, as we've kind of shown by talking about this, the historical examples are trickier and have more variables maybe. But I think in the current day with living artists, there's some easier objective truths to take away.
I think that can go a little too far, though, as well. I think I agree with the main point, but I want to push back in that, if I, like with the Radiohead example, if I continue to consume Radiohead's music, it's not me sort of implicitly condoning everything about them, every aspect of them. It is, in some sense, me saying, like, okay, they're allowed to make their own decisions, and I'm going to support them as artists and as individuals, and I don't think they've done anything detestable, but it's also not me condoning every single viewpoint that they put out publicly. It's not me signing on to every single thing Radiohead has done and will do from here on out. So I think there is some separation there that is important to maintain.
Well, I think, too, a lot of the examples we've explored are about actions more than they are about words. If we think about some of the examples we've talked about, even going back to the Sex Pistols, and we think about Sid Vicious murdering his girlfriend, I mean, that's something for me that already makes listening to the Sex Pistols a very complicated thing, realizing that he's one of many very powerful male figures who have harmed or killed their female partners. It makes it a lot harder for me to be enthusiastic about the idea of supporting the Sex Pistols. Now, of course, that's not something I knew when I was 16, 17, and I was just sort of exploring punk rock. But certainly at this stage in my life, that's something I know to be true about it. And I've definitely wrestled with whether or not I should include them in a history of rock for that reason. I will, because they're in the textbook and they're considered important figures. But when that sort of thing arises in the course of the class, I do feel like it's important to say something, and take a little bit of moral responsibility for including them in that historical survey. So I think I'd say I'd draw a line between, say, Radiohead and the Sex Pistols or Bill Cosby, because we're really talking about the difference between expressing an opinion and actually doing something that's actively harmful.
Yeah.
And I think going back to your earlier example, Chase, we were talking about a moral metric here. The fact that Radiohead hasn't actually harmed anybody with what they've said. They've maybe said some things that are a little boneheaded or offensive, but they're not actively causing harm to another living being is a reasonable standard to apply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I would say, Chase, that by listening to them, you are supporting them and that message, even in the smallest part, just by adding to, they have more money, they have more exposure, that message is exposed more, even if it's like another concert date, it might be such a small impact. And I think based on your metric of harm done, like Kate was saying, it doesn't really add up to anything bad, but I still think there is that relationship there.
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of undecided there. I'm not sure what I think. My instinct is to push back on that, but I don't know. You might be right. It's worth thinking about for sure.
Yeah.
One final sort of hypothetical to throw in there is, in the case of somebody like Sid Vicious murdering his girlfriend, maybe that's not the greatest case for this example, but if an artist has done something and justice has theoretically been served, say somebody, I don't know, stole someone's car, right? And they do the jail time and the community service, and they have made whatever reparations are appropriate for the crime that has been committed. From a legal standpoint, they're balanced off, they're squared away. From a social standpoint, maybe there's nothing explicitly political about it, other than the fact that now they are technically a convicted criminal. Is that still considered supporting those actions implicitly, or can you acknowledge that they've justice has been served and now support them purely from an artistic standpoint?
Well, I think if we take the example of someone like Phil Spector, Phil Spector is sitting in prison for murdering somebody. I don't know that he's ever made any restitution or that he's ever really acknowledged his role in the crime. And I feel uncomfortable. He is unquestionably a historically important figure if we're talking about the history of the music industry, the history of sound recording. His contributions to the development of the modern recording studio are undeniable. And the aesthetics that he created with very limited tools in the 1960s are pretty impressive. It's a tough question to answer because he is paying for his crime. So the question is, am I being irresponsible by listening to songs that he produced and wrote? Am I being irresponsible by including him in a class? And I think this is where, my inner historian ends up overriding some of my other thoughts about the subject, because he is unquestionably important. I think much more so ultimately in the history of music than someone like Sid Vicious. And that historicizing impulse for me starts to complicate my answer to that question.
Yeah.
I brought up knowledge before and, the role that plays. I do think there is a little bit of absolving, or at least responsibility that you take when like you do include somebody like that in a class, and you do help to educate people about the circumstances as well. I think in general, just cultivating knowledge in more people about more things and having a broader understanding of topics, I think is a better outcome for everybody in most things. So my intuition would be that as long as you are not giving a skewed interpretation of material or art or a person, as long as you do your best to be accurate in your representation of it, then I don't see the direct harm. What I mean is like by acknowledging the cultural significance of the artist and discussing them, I think the main duty you have is just to be accurate and truthful. And I think that's kind of the most important thing.
Yeah. Are there any other issues in this topic that either of you feel like we haven't hit, or any questions that you want to throw in the mix? Anything
I don't know.
else
I
you
think
want to
we've
cover?
covered it from a lot of angles. I don't know that I have anything new really to add to it beyond the examples that we've discussed. I mean, I'm sure we could go on forever finding examples of artists who were schmucks in history and trying to figuring out how we should be responding to them now. But it is, I think that we've touched on and really sketched out a lot of the ambiguity and complexity of the problem. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing I just wanted to bring up, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of this because it would be a whole other thing, but with comedians, we give them a certain amount of leeway, to make jokes that are offensive or off-putting because they serve, a cultural, a significant cultural, like importance to, bring things to the forefront or bring things to light and joke about them and expose things and just to keep people happy. Do we have the same, or should we give artists the same kind of leeway that we give comedians with that? And I think we do in some ways, but like Chase, with your example of Radiohead, even if let's say you agree with my statement and say that you still are in some way supporting them by consuming them, does that just not really matter just because we give artists the benefit of the doubt or the permission to go beyond with what we're comfortable with and express that and push boundaries, and we're not really responsible for that. And I think that's very different than some of the cases we've talked about with, people who have done actionable things to hurt people. But as far as ideology, if it's not directly harmful, I tend to think that giving artists a little bit more freedom seems to be a more sustainable way to go.
Well, especially because that can be so actively negotiated. I mean, I think about this when I think about the controversy from when Samantha Bee criticized Ivanka Trump and the language that she used. Many people thought that was a bridge too far, and yet there is a kind of feminist comedian's practice of trying to push the boundaries of what's understood as acceptable feminine behavior by appropriating these really ugly, violent words and using them and confronting people with them and taking ownership of them so that they lose their power as insult. And, I think that's an example of, the kind of transgression that comedy can make that's socially beneficial. But clearly she paid a tremendous price for using that particular word in a public forum and applying it to somebody as visible and as prominent as the president's daughter. So I don't know. I mean, I think that that's important. I think that there's definitely a place for it, both in comedy and the other arts. And, I think that that's something that those boundaries are always being tested and negotiated. So to my way of thinking, as long as there's still the freedom to negotiate and probe and push, that's the most important thing. And that individually we can all make our own judgments about whether or not that's the bridge too far or whether or not those kinds of transgressions are productive or useful in some way.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And part of what we're trying to do on the podcast is just conversations, and
Yeah.
further the discussion of things that don't get discussed or need to be discussed. So, yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, we will go ahead and transition to a segment we like to call the off topic. Kate, I know Alex told you about it, but it can basically be anything: a philosophical idea, something someone said to you at the grocery store, really anything that you want to talk about. We'll spend a little time on it. And yeah, what do you have for us?
Okay. Well, my off topic is RBG. I don't know if you have seen this documentary. It's playing in art theaters now. It's probably going to be on Amazon or Netflix in a matter of weeks. But it's a documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's always been a personal hero of mine. But one of the things I found most powerful about watching it was the degree to which it reminded me that women who were born between my grandmothers and my mother were in this unique space where they were really the first wave of women who were able to have a profession, in the sense that they trained for it the way men did. They made a deliberate choice to pick a field and, really derived a significant part of their identity from being lawyers or doctors or college professors or whatever the profession was. And the documentary is really powerful in the way that it traces it out. I mean, intellectually, I knew this history, but then thinking about what it must have been like to be a woman in law school in the late 1940s, when maybe you were one of 10 women in your entire class, and when no law firm in the United States would hire you. That was a really interesting moment, because I knew that as understanding the history of the 20th century, but just hearing her talk about it, hearing some of her colleagues and friends talk about that moment and how she responded to it and how she sort of worked her way around that and eventually found a platform for her ideas was really powerful. I also had no idea that she'd modeled a lot of her legal strategies arguing cases in front of the Supreme Court on Thurgood Marshall, and I found those parallels really rich and interesting. I also just want to add, she's a super badass. She goes to the gym and does this amazing killer workout. She's 84 years old. So whatever else I took away from it, I had major goals after I watched this. I mean, it's like, wow. I mean, no one-arm push-ups, but it was still really, really impressive. And I feel like, especially for younger women, it'd be really powerful to go out and see this thing, because it really just lays clear the institutional barriers of sexism in America in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and talks a lot about the powerful role she played in the 1970s in sort of dismantling the legal apparatus that kept all of that in place. So it's fist-raising. I saw it locally here. I live in Salem, Mass., and I was probably the youngest person in the theater, and all the people in the theater were like, yeah, and clapping, and it was great. It was uplifting, but it was also, I think, powerful for just reminding us, that that's not the distant past that we're talking about, but there's still a whole generation of women who were those pioneers, who were opening those doors to not just allow women to work, because women have always worked, but to allow women the luxury of defining themselves that way if they want to. And I think that was really powerful for me. And so I came away from that wanting to do both more push-ups and more reading about the law. So that's my off topic.
Hey, those are push-ups and the law are both great things. Do you feel like when you were watching the documentary that there were parts of her story that you could sort of compare to your experience as somebody who's, a working professional woman? And what were some of the things that you feel like maybe were different or the same between her progression in her career and yours so far?
Well, first of all, let me just say she's brilliant. And part of the reason she persevered under the circumstances is that she was so brilliant. And she had a very different strategy for sort of insinuating herself into positions where she could really make a difference, that she was a very quiet person, very deliberate, and one of those people where she really says exactly what she's going to say when she's delivering a statement to a court or crafting a brief, and that's it. She's really not a person of many words. I don't really relate to that, honestly, but I can understand, and I think from watching this documentary, I understood why that ended up being such a powerful form of resistance, that essentially she was a living counterexample to all these really pernicious stereotypes about being a woman. I haven't experienced nearly as much of that in my own life. So I think most of what I was reacting to is I wouldn't have the career that I do without people like her opening that door and making it possible. So I think for me, it was less that I was drawing parallels between myself and what I was seeing on the screen as just sort of contemplating the fact that my life is possible because of what she did. And that I think for me was the most moving thing. I got all emotional. I was like very excited while I was watching it and cheering. And when I got home and I started to talk about it with people, I was starting to get really choked up about it because I realized this incredible legacy that she's bequeathed to women, of my generation and younger. So,
yeah.
And I mentioned this on the last podcast we did, where we were talking about the Constitution and free speech and stuff. And I think our generation is basically the same point I made, but there's often a lack of historical context that we have because growing up, it didn't feel like, at least the people I was around, it didn't feel like that felt like a distant memory. And she's still around,
right.
She's still alive. She went through
right.
that, our grandparents' generation fought those battles. And I think there's a certain understanding and gratitude that we should cultivate, and just knowledge too about these figures. So I'm really glad you pushed that. I saw it was out, but I hadn't seen it yet. I did see her workout though.
Yeah, that's been featured prominently in the trailers, I think. Just so you know that she really is truly the notorious RBG. But one of the things I think that's interesting about your comment, Alex, is that it speaks to something else, which is that the politicization of curriculums in states across the United States has meant that history ends up becoming a football, that we can all agree on what people, sort of rudimentary skills, like you should know how to, do multiplication, complex multiplication by the fourth grade. But we're still really not in agreement about what historical narrative should be taught in schools. And it varies wildly from state to state. And that some of the most powerful states in the union when it comes to influencing textbooks and curriculum have ended up creating these kind of odd, almost counterfactual narratives about the history of the United States, so that it's not surprising to me that somebody who graduated from high school within the last 10 or 15 years has come away with a different understanding of the recent past than I did, because that was still very much a part of the high school curriculum. And whatever else I could say about the flaws of my high school history curriculum, we did actively confront those things, whether we're talking about the Japanese internment during World War II, talking about that sort of stain on FDR's legacy, or talking about the idea that manifest destiny is a white man's conception of how we treated the American Indians, and pushing back against that, and really talking about this program of incarceration on reservations, and the stripping away of whole classes of people's basic rights. Those were all things that I grappled with in a very straightforward, no-nonsense way when I was in high school because of the history curriculum. And I think for a lot of people that's been lost, or the message that they get from looking at a textbook is, well, that happened a long time ago and it's not really relevant to today. And yet, if we think about the civil rights movement right now, we're living through a moment where it seems like our own government is trying to dismantle it. When you think about the assaults on the Voting Rights Act, when you think about, the fact that the Supreme Court upheld this travel ban, which is predicated primarily on people's religious identification more than any deep understanding of geopolitics or terrorism, I think that these things are really relevant, and having powerful reminders of that and first-person testimonials really may be the most effective way to counteract some of that.
Yeah, I really see the need for more intergenerational conversations, because especially with social media, we often get boxed into our little groups of like-minded and similar people. And I just don't see too many people my age having conversations about politics successfully with people in their 70s or, and I don't see much fruitful conversation come when it does happen. But there's such valuable different perspectives each generation has. I think we'd be wise to pay attention to that more.
One of the most powerful things I've seen on television was this interview that Jon Stewart did with George Takei on The Daily Show. And one of the things that George Takei was doing, besides sharing his own immediate memories of having his family's property stripped away, being shipped off to a location where nobody would tell them where they were going or what the purpose of this trip was, and then being essentially put in a prison camp for several years. That was powerful, but so too was the way he talked about Earl Warren, who was one of the chief architects of that decision, not in his capacity as somebody on the Supreme Court, but as governor of California. Mm-hmm. Earl Warren, of course, was also one of the people who was responsible for authoring some of the most important decisions in the civil rights era in the 1950s and 60s, things that overturned decisions like, Plessy v. Ferguson. And to sort of hold in your mind that somebody could on the one hand play such an important role in sort of dismantling Jim Crow, and while on the other could have made this really terrible calculation when he was governor of California that pushing for the removal of Japanese American citizens from California was a politically expedient thing to do. That to me was like, that is a conversation that nobody talks about. That when I've read about Earl Warren, he's almost always presented as an uncomplicated figure, an unproblematic figure. And hearing from somebody of George Takei's generation talking not only about his own experiences, but how that's shaped the way he thinks about somebody like Earl Warren was really powerful. So I think you're right. We need a lot more of that kind of dialogue between generations and hearing other people's perspectives, and then having people share their own immediate experiences. I mean, I hope when I'm 70, I have an opportunity to share my experiences living through, say, 9/11, when I was living in New York City on that day, with somebody who's 20 or 30 years old, and really explaining what that felt like, and then, how that informed my worldview afterwards. So,
yeah, this is all just making me very grateful for the history education that I had. I went to a private school, kindergarten through 8th grade, and luckily, I feel like the historical narrative there was one where we were able to get sort of comprehensive, or at least more comprehensive view of, sort of events in American history and 20th century world history, to a point where, things were emotionally available to us. Mm-hmm. We sort of saw the details of, like, this is what it looks like when, people's rights are starting to become infringed. And this is what it looks like when, these sorts of political situations start unfolding. And, going from that private middle school to public high school and seeing that not everybody had that historical context was interesting. Mm-hmm. But also growing up in a family where, and you wouldn't be able to tell by my skin color on camera, but my dad's parents are Black Americans who were born in the 40s, mm-hmm. and they had kids in the 60s. And, growing up, I had heard stories from them about, the sort of highlight civil rights mm-hmm. things like the bus boycott or riots in Detroit. Mm-hmm. But until a couple of years ago, they moved in with my parents, and I sort of got to spend a lot more time with them and hear some of the more everyday, mm-hmm. day-to-day stories and hear their experiences, in an era where sort of casual racism was just a thing that happened. Mm-hmm. Like, my grandfather, being in the Army, experienced it way more than what somebody in the Army today would think is normal. And, being able to grow up in a family where I could hear stories like that, I think mm-hmm. made a lot of that a little more available to mm-hmm. me than the typical American education mm-hmm. makes available to people. And this conversation has just made me grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, I think also, one of the things you talk about, emotionally available, I think that's really key. And I hope that more important figures, like someone like the Representative John Lewis, collaborated on a 3-volume series on the civil rights movement called March. It's a graphic novel series that's written for kids. It's probably most appropriate for kids who are like 6th, 7th grade. That's about the reading level of the text. And one of the things that really struck me when I looked at it was just how powerfully it connects you to the emotions of all the people who were protesting. It gives you a sense of what they were really risking, sense of the incredible hostility that they faced, which is something that often gets lost in the really sanitized way that we talk about the civil rights movement, about Martin Luther King Jr., and the fact that people who are extraordinarily conservative have sort of appropriated him as a symbol of the way they think people should be protesting. Says a lot about historical ignorance, because if you go back to the 1960s, he was often portrayed as an enemy of the people, and very explicitly so. And I think helping people feel the emotions around these historical events as the historical actors themselves experience them is really powerful. And you're lucky that you have that opportunity to talk to your grandparents and have that extra connection because they're family members telling you about these. So it's not an abstraction, but something that's part of the shared history of your family. And I think that we need a lot more of that.
Yeah. Well, any final thoughts on this topic or anything else we've been talking about?
No, you guys have asked lots of great provocative questions and offered great examples, so I don't have anything else to say.
Well, Kate, it was wonderful having you on.
Thank you.
Your input has been invaluable to this conversation, and I really appreciate having you around to talk about these things. Thanks so much for talking with us.
Terrific. It was really my pleasure, Chase. It was great to meet you and Alex, to reconnect and hear what you're doing and see what you're doing right now. So thank you for that opportunity. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kate.